Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The bitter December wind that swept through London's fog-shrouded streets on Christmas Eve, 1895, carried with it whispers of an occurrence so extraordinary that even the most hardened constables of Scotland Yard found themselves crossing themselves when they spoke of it. In the ancient parish church of St. Bartholomew's, nestled in the shadowed lanes of Whitechapel, the midnight mass had concluded with an event that would challenge the very foundations of rational thought and draw the attention of the one man in London capable of unravelling its mysteries. The church itself was a testament to medieval craftsmanship, its Gothic arches reaching heavenward through centuries of London's grime and glory. On this holiest of nights, the nave had been filled to capacity with the faithful, their breath visible in the cold air as candles flickered against the stained glass windows. The Reverend Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a man of scholarly disposition and unshakable faith, had been conducting the sacred service when the impossible occurred. At the moment of the elevation, as the consecrated host was raised above the altar, a figure materialized in the chancel. Not the gradual appearance of stage trickery, but a sudden, luminous manifestation that drew gasps of terror from the assembled congregation. The apparition wore the flowing robes of a medieval monk, its face pale as churchyard marble, and it raised one spectral hand to point directly at the ornate silver reliquary that housed the church's most precious relic, a fragment of bone said to belong to St. Bartholomew himself. "Behold the theft of sacred trust," the figure intoned, its voice carrying with unnatural clarity to every corner of the church. "Death comes to those who defile the holy sanctuary." The congregation erupted in panic. Women fainted, men shouted, and children wailed as the faithful pressed toward the exits. In the chaos that followed, two discoveries were made that transformed supernatural spectacle into criminal mystery. First, the ancient reliquary had vanished from its locked tabernacle, despite the fact that only the reverend and the churchwarden possessed keys. Second, and far more disturbing, Sir Reginald Ashworth, a prominent philanthropist and vocal skeptic of supernatural phenomena, was found dead in the locked vestry, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. It was in the early hours of Christmas morning that Dr. Watson was roused from his warm bed by urgent knocking at the door of 221B Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson's protests echoed up the stairs as she admitted a visitor whose distress was evident even through the closed door of their lodgings. "Holmes," Watson called softly, knowing his friend's habits well. "We have a visitor." Sherlock Holmes emerged from his bedroom, already fully dressed despite the hour, his keen grey eyes alert with interest. "I have been expecting someone, Watson. The evening papers carried hints of something extraordinary in Whitechapel, though they lacked the courage to print the full account." The man who entered their sitting room was Reverend Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 50 years, whose normally composed demeanour had been shattered by the night's events. His clerical collar was askew, his usually neat grey hair dishevelled, and his hands trembled as he removed his coat. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear, "I come to you because Scotland Yard has declared my case beyond their capabilities. They speak of mass hallucination and coincidental death, but I know what I witnessed was both supernatural in appearance and criminal in execution." Holmes gestured to a chair by the fire while Watson prepared brandy for their distressed guest. "Pray, sit and compose yourself, Reverend. Tell us exactly what transpired at your midnight service." As Dr. Whitmore recounted the evening's events, Holmes listened with that peculiar intensity that Watson had learned to recognize as complete absorption. When the Reverend finished his account, Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Before we proceed further," Holmes said, "allow me to observe that you have recently changed your evening routine. You have taken to carrying a walking stick, one that belonged to your predecessor, judging by the wear pattern on the handle and the fact that it is slightly too short for your frame. Moreover, you have been receiving threatening correspondence, as evidenced by the ink stains on your right cuff from hastily opening letters and the faint odor of cheap paper and inferior ink that clings to your person." Dr. Whitmore stared in amazement. "Extraordinary. Yes, I began carrying Dean Morrison's old stick after receiving anonymous warnings about walking alone at night. And the letters, how could you possibly know?" "Elementary observation," Holmes replied with a slight smile. "But more importantly, these details confirm that your midnight apparition was not the random manifestation of supernatural forces, but rather the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Someone has been watching you, threatening you, and preparing for last night's performance." Watson set down his brandy glass with a sharp clink. "Holmes, surely you don't suggest that someone staged a supernatural appearance before dozens of witnesses?" "I suggest nothing yet, Watson, but I observe that we have a locked room theft, an impossible death, and a ghostly accusation that has conveniently eliminated the one man most likely to expose supernatural fraud through rational investigation." Holmes rose and reached for his coat. "Reverend, I believe we must examine your church immediately. If my suspicions are correct, the evidence of this elaborate deception will not long survive the scrutiny of those who orchestrated it." Dr. Whitmore looked puzzled. "But surely the investigation can wait until daylight." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light of intellectual pursuit. "My dear sir, in cases involving apparent supernatural phenomena, the truth often reveals itself most clearly in the very conditions under which the deception was perpetrated. Besides, if someone has gone to such elaborate lengths to create a ghostly performance, they may well return to remove any traces of their stagecraft." As the three men prepared to venture into the fog-shrouded streets of London, Watson could not shake the feeling that they were about to encounter one of Holmes's most challenging cases, one where the boundary between the supernatural and the criminal would prove dangerously thin, and where the solution would require not only logical deduction, but an understanding of the very human capacity for both faith and deception. The Reverend gathered his composure as they descended to the waiting hansom cab. "Gentlemen, I must warn you that the atmosphere at St. Bartholomew's has become oppressive since the incident. Even I find myself questioning the evidence of my own senses." Holmes helped him into the cab with characteristic efficiency. "Doubt is the beginning of wisdom, Reverend. Now, as we travel to Whitechapel, I want you to recall every detail of your church's layout, every person who had access to the building, and every unusual occurrence in the weeks preceding your midnight visitor. In cases such as these, the supernatural often proves to be merely the spectacular, and the impossible merely the improbable executed with extraordinary skill." The hansom cab rattled through London's fog-shrouded streets, its wheels echoing against wet cobblestones as the three men made their way toward Whitechapel. The thick December mist swirled around the gas lamps like restless spirits, and Watson pulled his coat tighter against the penetrating chill. Beside him, Holmes sat with characteristic stillness, his sharp profile silhouetted against the window as his mind clearly worked through the puzzle before them. The Reverend Dr. Whitmore clutched his predecessor's walking stick with white knuckles, occasionally murmuring prayers under his breath. "Tell me more about these threatening letters, Reverend," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the contemplative silence. "When precisely did they begin arriving, and what was their specific nature?" Dr. Whitmore's grip tightened on the walking stick. "The first arrived 6 weeks ago, just after All Saints' Day. Initially, I dismissed it as the work of some disturbed parishioner, but they grew increasingly specific and menacing. The writer claimed to possess knowledge of some great sin committed within the church, something that would bring scandal upon the parish if revealed. And the demands that I resign my position and leave London immediately, or face what the writer called divine judgment for the desecration of sacred trust. The Reverend's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The final letter arrived yesterday morning, Christmas Eve. It simply said, "Tonight the dead shall speak and the guilty shall be revealed." Holmes leaned forward with interest. "You kept these letters, I trust?" "I gave them to Inspector Lestrade this morning, though in light of the supernatural manifestation and Sir Reginald's death he seemed to regard them as secondary concerns." "Nothing is secondary in a case such as this," Holmes replied curtly. "Now, the reliquary that was stolen, tell us about its security arrangements and value." Dr. Whitmore straightened slightly, finding comfort in factual details. "The reliquary is housed within an ancient oak tabernacle, reinforced with iron bands and secured by 3 separate locks. Only myself and Mr. Abel Pritchard, our senior churchwarden, possess complete sets of keys. The reliquary itself is a medieval silver casket adorned with precious stones, containing what is believed to be a bone fragment of St. Bartholomew himself." "Its monetary value?" Watson inquired. "Dean Morrison had it appraised for insurance purposes shortly before his death. The valuation exceeded £800, a considerable sum that would tempt any common thief, though one wonders why such a criminal would resort to theatrical supernatural manifestations when simple burglary might suffice." Holmes's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Precisely the question that interests me most, Reverend. Theatricality suggests purpose beyond mere theft, a desire to send a message, create fear, or perhaps conceal the true motive behind an elaborate facade." The cab lurched to a halt outside St. Bartholomew's Church, its Gothic spires barely visible through the swirling fog. The ancient building loomed before them like a sleeping giant, its stone facade blackened by centuries of London's industrial breath. Even in the pre-dawn gloom, Watson could sense the weight of history that clung to these walls, the accumulated prayers and sorrows of generations who had sought solace within. A constable stood guard at the main entrance, stamping his feet against the cold and looking thoroughly miserable. As they approached, Holmes's entire demeanour sharpened, like a hunting hound catching a scent. His keen eyes swept across the church's exterior, taking in details that would escape ordinary observation. The placement of windows, the accessibility of various entrances, the relationship between the building and its surrounding structures. "Constable," Holmes addressed the guard with brisk authority. "I am Sherlock Holmes, consulting on this matter. Has anyone entered or left the building since Inspector Lestrade secured the scene?" The young policeman straightened respectfully. "No, sir, not through the main door, though I should mention that Inspector Lestrade only sealed this entrance. The church has a vestry door on the north side, where the gentleman was found." "Show us," Holmes commanded. They followed the constable around the building's perimeter, their footsteps muffled by the thick fog. The vestry door bore the wax seal of Scotland Yard, but Holmes immediately knelt to examine the ground beneath it, producing his magnifying glass despite the poor light. "Watson, observe the mud here," he murmured. "Several overlapping footprints from the police investigation, but notice this set leading away from the door." He pointed to a series of clear impressions that diverged from the others, heading toward a narrow alley. Made by expensive leather boots with a distinctive worn heel, and crucially they overlay the constable's regulation footprints, indicating they were made after the police departed. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," came a familiar voice from the church entrance. Inspector Lestrade emerged from the shadows, his small frame bundled in a greatcoat, his breath visible in the frigid air. "I should have laid my life that you would smell this mystery before breakfast, Dr. Watson, Reverend Whitmore." His sharp eyes assessed their group with professional interest. "What have you determined thus far, Lestrade?" Holmes inquired, rising from his examination of the footprints. "A locked-room mystery, if ever there was one," Lestrade replied, with a mixture of frustration and grudging excitement. "Sir Reginald found dead in the vestry, door locked from the inside, key still in the lock. No mark of violence that we could see, though the doctor will tell us more. As for the reliquary, vanished as cleanly as if whisked away by angels themselves." "Or by someone with intimate knowledge of the church's layout and security," Holmes observed. "The tabernacle, how was it opened?" "That's the curious thing. Fresh scratching around the lock mechanism, too minute for casual observation, but not made by a key. Yet there's no sign of conventional lock-picking tools being used." Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most interesting. And the scene has been preserved exactly as found?" "To the letter, Mr. Holmes. Nothing disturbed, though I confess the atmosphere in there is enough to unsettle even a practical man." Holmes produced his lock-picking tools and gained entry to the church with practiced efficiency. The interior of St. Bartholomew's was shrouded in darkness, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the vast space. The detective struck a match, revealing the nave in flickering detail, rows of wooden pews, soaring Gothic arches, and at the far end, the altar, where the night's supernatural drama had unfolded. "Light only the necessary candles, Watson," Holmes instructed. "We must not advertise our presence to any interested observers who might still be watching." As Watson carefully illuminated their immediate surroundings, Holmes began his methodical examination of the chancel. He moved with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a scholar, his keen eyes taking in every surface, every shadow, every angle from which the mysterious apparition might have materialized. At the chancel step, he paused and knelt, touching the ancient flagstone with his finger before bringing it to his nose. "Frankincense from the service," he murmured, "but this is different." He indicated a faint powdery smear that showed a peculiar pearly sheen under the lantern light. Scraping a few grains into an envelope, he slipped it into his pocket without comment. His gaze travelled upward to the chancel arch and the dark recesses of the organ loft above. "Watson, direct your light toward that pillar. Higher, yes." A nearly invisible thread hung a few inches from the stone, cut clean. Holmes plucked it free with delicate fingers. "Catgut," he observed with apparent indifference, though Watson recognized the gleam of satisfaction in his friend's eyes. The tabernacle stood to the right of the altar, an exquisitely worked silver casket housed within an oaken cupboard. Its tiny door hung open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Holmes drew his magnifying lens and examined the lock mechanism with minute attention. "The scratching Lestrade mentioned is indeed present," he confirmed. "But observe, Watson, the marks are too precise, too controlled for conventional lockpicking. Someone with intimate knowledge of this particular mechanism has been at work here." He leaned closer, inhaling delicately. "Do you detect anything unusual, Watson?" Watson sniffed carefully. "Wax and incense, certainly." "And magnesium," Holmes added, almost to himself. "We must determine who has access to the organ loft and who tends the gas fixtures. The combination of magnesium and precise mechanical knowledge suggests our ghost may have had assistance from the realm of chemistry and engineering." Dr. Whitmore stepped forward hesitantly. "The organist is Mr. Alfred Peabody, a conscientious man, though somewhat severe in temperament. Young Collins, the choirmaster's nephew, typically operates the bellows. As for the gas fixtures, Mr. Pritchard handles all such maintenance. He is methodical in all church matters. Lestrade gave a low whistle. Your methodical churchwarden may have some explaining to do. Holmes's lip twitched with the ghost of a smile. We shall afford him that opportunity presently. But first, the vestry, where Sir Reginald met his mysterious end. As they prepared to examine the locked room where death had claimed the sceptical philanthropist, Watson felt the familiar thrill of intellectual pursuit that always accompanied Holmes's investigations. Yet something about this case, the combination of apparent supernatural phenomena with methodical criminal planning, suggested they were dealing with an adversary of unusual cunning and theatrical flair. The ghost of St. Bartholomew's was beginning to reveal itself as a very human creation, but the mind behind its manifestation remained tantalizingly hidden in the shadows of the ancient church. Lestrade produced his key with professional efficiency and broke the official wax seal that had secured the vestry door since the previous night's discovery. The heavy oak portal swung inward with a protesting creak, releasing a wave of stale air that carried the mingled scents of old parchment, ecclesiastical incense, and something indefinably metallic that made Watson's trained nostrils twitch with recognition. The vestry was a cramped, austere chamber, lined with oak cupboards containing ceremonial vestments and liturgical objects. Sir Reginald Ashworth's body had been removed to the morgue, but chalk lines on the flagstone floor marked precisely where the distinguished philanthropist had been discovered. Holmes stepped immediately to these outlines, his keen eyes absorbing every detail of the scene with that peculiar intensity Watson had learned to recognize as complete intellectual absorption. He was found seated in this chair, Lestrade explained, indicating a high-backed wooden seat positioned against the far wall, facing the door, key turned in the lock from the inside. No mark of violence that we could determine, though his expression suggested he had died in the grip of absolute terror. Holmes knelt beside the chalk outline, producing his magnifying glass to examine the chair itself. Fresh gouges scarred the wooden armrests where fingernails had clawed desperately at the ancient oak. Sir Reginald did not die peacefully, he observed. These marks indicate a struggle against some overwhelming force, yet there are no signs of physical combat. What manner of terror could reduce a rational man to such desperate clawing? Watson moved to examine the door mechanism, while Holmes continued his forensic investigation. The key remained exactly as it had been found, turned fully to the locked position from the interior side. Yet, as Watson studied the brass fitting more closely, he noticed something that had escaped previous observation. Holmes, observe this, he called softly. The key shows a peculiar bright arc of polish on its head, inconsistent with normal wear patterns. Holmes rose immediately and joined his colleague at the door. Under his magnifying lens, the polished crescent became clearly visible, a mark that could only have been made by repeated friction from a thin cord or wire. More significantly, Holmes discovered a tiny nick in the door jamb at the exact height of the keyhole, carved by the passage of such a line. "The locked room ceases to be impossible," Holmes murmured with satisfaction. A length of catgut, passed through the keyhole and looped around the key's head, would allow the door to be secured from the corridor beyond. Once the turn was complete, the cord could be withdrawn, leaving no trace save these microscopic indicators. He produced a small envelope from his waistcoat and carefully collected several metallic granules that clung to the door frame. Note also these chemical residues, Watson. The same magnesium compounds we discovered in the chancel, suggesting our ghost required illumination for his earthly machinations. Their attention turned to the room's single gas fixture, mounted on the wall beside where Sir Reginald had been seated. Holmes struck a match and held it near the brass fitting without lighting the jet, watching the subtle air currents with scientific precision. The connection showed clear signs of recent tampering, fresh scratches around the joint, and a faint, sweet odor that became detectable when Holmes loosened the fitting slightly. "The gas supply has been modified," he announced, tightening the connection once more. "Someone with considerable technical knowledge has altered this fixture, though whether to introduce additional gases or create some form of optical effect remains to be determined." Behind the door, concealed when the portal stood open, Holmes discovered a crude symbol scratched into the ancient wood, a circle containing what appeared to be a stylized flame. The carving was fresh, its edges sharp, and the exposed wood still pale. "Reverend," Holmes called to Dr. Whitmore, who had been observing from the threshold with evident unease, "does this marking hold significance in your church's history?" The clergyman studied the symbol carefully, his scholarly instincts overcoming his distress. "It resembles the seal of the medieval penitent brothers, a monastic order that once maintained a chapel on this very site. The brotherhood was dissolved centuries ago, and their records were lost in the Great Fire of London. Yet someone possesses intimate knowledge of their symbols," Holmes mused. "Combined with the technical expertise required to modify gas fittings and create mechanical illusions, we begin to see the profile of our ghost. Tell me, who among your parishioners combines such historical scholarship with practical engineering skills?" Dr. Whitmore's face grew troubled. "Mr. Abel Pritchard, our senior churchwarden, is extraordinarily knowledgeable about the church's medieval past. He also maintains all our gas fixtures and mechanical systems with meticulous precision." Holmes's eyes gleamed with the light of intellectual pursuit. "The same Mr. Pritchard who possesses keys to the tabernacle and access to every corner of St. Bartholomew's. Lestrade, I believe we must pay our methodical churchwarden an immediate visit. The morning grows late, and I suspect Mr. Pritchard may already be preparing to distance himself from last night's theatrical performance." As they prepared to leave the vestry, Holmes paused for one final observation. "Note how every element of this crime demonstrates careful planning and intimate knowledge of the church's structure. Our ghost is no supernatural entity, but rather a very human conspirator with both the means and opportunity to orchestrate an elaborate deception. The question now becomes, was the theft of the reliquary the ultimate goal, or merely a convenient cover for the elimination of Sir Reginald Ashworth? The journey to Pritchard's lodgings took them through the awakening streets of Whitechapel, where the fog hung in sullen wreaths around the gas lamps, and the first stirrings of Christmas morning could be heard from the surrounding tenements. Holmes maintained his characteristic silence during the cab ride, his sharp profile etched against the window as his mind clearly worked through the accumulating evidence. Watson observed his friend's familiar intensity, recognizing the signs of a case that had captured Holmes's complete intellectual attention. "Inspector," Holmes said suddenly as their hansom turned into Dorset Street, "I want you to position 2 constables discreetly around Pritchard's residence before we make our approach. If our churchwarden is indeed our theatrical ghost, he may attempt to dispose of incriminating evidence once he realizes the scope of our investigation." Lestrade nodded grimly. "You believe he's our man, then?" "I believe he possesses the means, opportunity, and specialized knowledge required for last night's performance," Holmes replied carefully. "Whether he also possessed sufficient motive remains to be determined. The theft of an £800 reliquary provides obvious financial incentive, but the elaborate supernatural staging suggests deeper psychological motivations." Dr. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I find it difficult to accept that Abel Pritchard, a man who has served our church faithfully for 15 years, could orchestrate such a sacrilegious deception. His devotion to St. Bartholomew's has been exemplary. Devotion can take many forms, Reverend, Holmes observed. Sometimes the most passionate believers become the most dangerous when they perceive threats to their faith or institution. Number 17. Dorset Street proved to be a respectable lodging house, its facade well maintained despite the modest neighbourhood. Mrs. Hartwell, the sharp-eyed landlady, answered their knock with the wariness common to her profession when confronted by official visitors at an early hour. Mrs. Hartwell, Dr. Whitmore addressed her with gentle authority, these gentlemen are investigating the distressing events at St. Bartholomew's. We need to speak with Mr. Pritchard regarding his duties as churchwarden. The woman's expression shifted from suspicion to concern. Oh, the terrible business with the apparition and poor Sir Reginald. Mr. Pritchard returned in such a state this morning, muttering about divine judgment and ancient sins. He's been pacing his rooms like a caged animal since dawn, and that's not like him at all. Usually methodical as clockwork he is. Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. Has he left the building since returning from the church? Not once, sir, though he did send young Billy from the kitchen to deliver a message somewhere in the city. Paid the lad a whole shilling for the errand, which is unlike Mr. Pritchard's usual careful ways with money. They climbed the narrow staircase, guided by the sound of restless footsteps from the second floor. Holmes knocked with firm authority, and the movement within immediately ceased. Mr. Pritchard, Dr. Whitmore called through the door, I have brought Inspector Lestrade and Mr. Sherlock Holmes to discuss the events at the church. Please open the door. A long pause followed, during which Watson could hear laboured breathing through the thin wood. When the door finally opened, Abel Pritchard stood, revealed as a man in the grip of profound agitation. His usually neat appearance was dishevelled, his greying hair uncombed, and his hands trembled as he clutched the door frame. "Reverend," he whispered hoarsely, "I have been expecting you. The manifestation last night, it was a sign, a divine revelation of corruption that has been festering within our sacred walls." Holmes stepped forward with practised authority. "Mr. Pritchard, we are investigating the theft of the reliquary and the death of Sir Reginald Ashworth. As senior churchwarden, your cooperation is essential. May we enter?" The man's eyes darted nervously between his visitors, but he stepped aside with obvious reluctance. The modest room beyond showed signs of considerable disorder, papers scattered across a small desk, wooden crates stacked against the walls, and the distinctive odour of metallic compounds hanging in the close air. Holmes's keen gaze immediately catalogued the scene. Upon the desk lay glass vials, measuring instruments, and what appeared to be chemical preparations. A coil of fine catgut protruded from a partially opened drawer, while a small tin bearing traces of pearlescent powder sat among a collection of precision tools. "You have been conducting experiments, Mr. Pritchard," Holmes observed, moving toward the desk. "These appear to be preparations involving magnesium compounds, substances commonly used to create luminous effects." Pritchard's face went ashen. "Those materials are for maintenance of the church's gas fixtures, nothing more. A churchwarden must understand combustible substances to ensure the congregation's safety." "Indeed," Holmes replied smoothly, examining a glass tube filled with the same pearlescent powder they had discovered in the chancel. "Yet this particular compound would serve no purpose in gas fixture maintenance. It is, however, perfectly suited to creating the illusion of supernatural luminescence when properly dispersed." Watson investigated the wooden crates while Holmes continued his chemical examination. Inside, carefully packed in sawdust, lay an assortment of mechanical devices, pulleys, thin cables, and what appeared to be a collapsible framework designed for creating movement at a distance. Mr. Pritchard, Lestrade interjected with growing authority, these materials suggest preparation for theatrical effects rather than church maintenance. I must ask you to account for your exact whereabouts during last night's service. The churchwarden sank into a chair, his composure cracking visibly. You do not understand the full scope of what has been happening at St. Bartholomew's. The apparition was divine, retribution for crimes that have been committed against our church over many months. Holmes's interest sharpened immediately. Explain yourself, Mr. Pritchard. What crimes? Small thefts at first. Silver candlesticks disappeared from the vestry. An ancient chalice vanished from the sacristy. Medieval manuscripts went missing from the archives. I suspected someone with access to the church was systematically looting our treasures, but I could never gather sufficient evidence to present to the authorities. Dr. Whitmore looked genuinely shocked. Abel, why did you never report these suspicions to me? Because, Pritchard replied with growing agitation, I believed the thief might be someone within our own congregation, possibly even someone in a position of trust. I began my own investigation, trying to identify the culprit without creating scandal. Holmes leaned forward intently. And Sir Reginald Ashworth's role in these thefts? Pritchard's expression grew bitter. He claimed to be investigating supernatural phenomena for scientific purposes, but his questions about the reliquary's security arrangements and the church's most valuable artifacts seemed far too detailed for mere scholarly interest. I began to suspect he was documenting our defences for criminal purposes. A serious accusation, Watson observed. Did you confront him with these suspicions? I attempted to discuss my concerns, but Sir Reginald dismissed them contemptuously. He said my medieval superstitions were clouding my judgment, and that rational investigation would expose all the church's secrets. Pritchard's hands clenched into fists. His arrogance was insufferable. Holmes rose and moved to examine the mechanical devices more closely. These preparations in your possession, Mr. Pritchard, combined with your intimate knowledge of the church's structure and your access to all areas, suggest a level of planning that goes far beyond casual investigation. The evidence points to someone who orchestrated last night's supernatural performance with considerable skill. The churchwarden's eyes filled with tears of apparent frustration. Mr. Holmes, I swear upon my sacred oath as a servant of this church, I did not create that apparition. Whatever power manifested in our chancel last night, it was not of human origin. The divine has intervened to expose the corruption that has been eating at St. Bartholomew's like a cancer. Before Holmes could press his interrogation further, rapid footsteps echoed on the staircase. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with exertion. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," she called breathlessly, "but there's been a development. Young Billy has just returned from his errand, and he says there are strange lights flickering in the church windows, visible even in daylight. The neighbours are gathering in the street, crossing themselves and speaking of miracles." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "How long ago did you send this message, Mr. Pritchard? And to whom was it directed?" The churchwarden's face had gone completely white. I sent word to my cousin in Bermondsey asking him to come at once, but there should be no lights in the church at this hour. The building was sealed by the police." "Then it appears," Holmes said grimly, "that our ghost is not finished with his earthly manifestations. Inspector, we must return to St. Bartholomew's immediately. If someone is still manipulating events from within that church, we may catch them in the very act of their deception." As they prepared to depart, Watson noticed that Pritchard's trembling had intensified, and the man seemed genuinely terrified by the news of continued supernatural activity. Either the churchwarden was an accomplished actor, or their investigation had taken an unexpected turn that would require Holmes's most careful analysis to unravel. The return journey to St. Bartholomew's was accomplished with urgent haste, their hansom careening through the narrow streets, while Holmes maintained that peculiar intensity Watson had learned to associate with a case reaching its critical juncture. Even from several streets away, they could observe that a considerable crowd had gathered around the ancient church, their faces turned upward toward windows that flickered with an otherworldly luminescence despite the morning hour. "Observe the pattern, Watson," Holmes said, producing a small, collapsible telescope as their cab drew near. "The illumination is not random. It pulses with deliberate rhythm, almost like a signal. Note also the color, a phosphorescent green quite unlike any natural light source." The assembled faithful stood in hushed clusters along the cobblestones, many crossing themselves as they witnessed what appeared to be supernatural manifestations in broad daylight. An elderly woman clutched her prayer book tightly, whispering, "The spirits walk among us now, even with the sun upon us." Holmes leaped from the cab before it had fully stopped, his keen gaze immediately cataloguing every detail of the scene. The mysterious lights emanated from the upper reaches of the church, specifically from the clerestory windows near the organ loft, creating an eerie dance of coloured shadows across the Gothic stonework. "Lestrade!" he called sharply. "Position your constables around the entire perimeter. Someone is orchestrating this display from within, and they must not escape through the numerous medieval passages that honeycomb this structure." While the inspector deployed his men, Holmes began his characteristic examination of the building's exterior. At the north transept, his sharp eyes detected what others had missed: a narrow window set high in the wall, its ancient latch showing fresh oil stains and recent scratches. "Watson, observe this entry point," he said, pointing upward. "Someone with considerable agility and intimate knowledge of the building's architecture has used this route within the past few hours. The window leads directly to the organ loft." Dr. Whitmore approached with obvious reluctance, his face pale but determined. "That would be young Timothy Collins's usual access point when he tends the organ's pneumatic system. The boy has shown remarkable mechanical aptitude since joining us 18 months ago after his parents' tragic death." Holmes's eyebrows rose with interest. Mechanical expertise, access to hidden areas, and knowledge of the church's most vulnerable points, a compelling combination for our theatrical ghost. As if summoned by their discussion, an ethereal melody began emanating from within the church. Not the familiar tones of the great organ, but something stranger and more haunting. The assembled crowd murmured in awe, many falling to their knees in spontaneous prayer. "That melody," Dr. Whitmore said with growing alarm, "resembles the ancient penitent brothers' chant, supposedly lost for centuries. How could anyone possess such knowledge?" "The same way they knew the Brotherhood symbols," Holmes replied grimly, producing his lock-picking tools. "Through access to documents others believe destroyed. Watson, prepare yourself. We are about to confront someone who has demonstrated both technical brilliance and a willingness to commit murder." They entered the church cautiously, moving through the shadowed nave toward the source of the mysterious illumination. The phosphorescent light danced across ancient stone pillars while the haunting melody surrounded them with harmonies that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Holmes paused at the chancel steps, his trained ear analyzing the acoustic properties. "The sound is being channeled through the organ's pipe system, but modified to create these ethereal effects. Our ghost possesses not only mechanical expertise but considerable knowledge of musical acoustics and psychological manipulation." Above them, in the organ loft, a shadow moved briefly across one of the high windows. Holmes pointed silently, and they began ascending the narrow spiral staircase that led to the gallery above. They found their ghost at his apparatus, a figure crouched over an ingenious contrivance of mirrors and a modified lantern fitted with a perforated wheel. The device rendered ordinary light phosphorescent green through chemical screens, creating the illusion of supernatural manifestation. Fine tubes connected the apparatus to gas branches, while nearly invisible wires disappeared into the shadows where gauze screens had been strategically positioned to receive projected images. At their sudden appearance, the hooded operator jerked upward and sprang toward the far staircase. Holmes cut off his escape route with a swift movement, causing the figure to stumble on a coil of catgut and fall to his knees with a cry of despair. Lestrade seized the fugitive by the collar, pulling back the hood to reveal the pale, frightened face of young Timothy Collins. "So our ghost has a voice that cracks on the high notes," the inspector said triumphantly. The apparatus scattered across the gallery floor told its own story: perforated discs, vials of pearlescent powder, loops of fine wire, and a theatrical supplier's handbill from a Holborn address. Collins began confessing before questions were even formed. "I didn't mean no harm, sir," he babbled desperately. "I was only paid to create the lights and sounds, nothing more. The gentleman said it was to make a solemn effect for the Christmas service. Nothing wicked intended." "What gentleman?" Lestrade demanded. "Name him immediately." "I don't know his proper name, sir." A careful sort who kept to the shadows, well-dressed gentleman with grey whiskers and a soft hat. He had a manner like he was accustomed to being obeyed by his inferiors. Holmes, who had remained silent during this exchange, examined the apparatus with scientific precision. He lifted the chemical screen, touched a flake to his tongue, and identified the compounds with professional expertise. More significantly, he discovered a small tin wedged beneath the lantern's base, reading its label before slipping it discreetly into his pocket. "Your boots, young man," Holmes said with deceptive casualness. Collins obliged with a trembling foot, allowing Holmes to compare the cheap, iron-tipped soles with dusty impressions near the cable coil. The prints showed a fine, narrow instep and distinctive wear pattern that clearly did not match the expensive leather boot marks they had discovered outside the vestry. "As I suspected," Holmes murmured, his eyes flickering with satisfaction. "You are merely the instrument, not the composer of this elaborate symphony." Collins, eager to please his captors, pointed toward the chancel below. "There's more equipment, sir. The gentleman showed me how to work the powder dispenser and mirror system. He said there was to be a holy symbol carved in the vestry to make it appear sanctified. He laughed when he explained it, sir, though I didn't understand the jest." "A blasphemer with antiquarian knowledge," Watson observed grimly, recalling the medieval symbol they had discovered. Holmes extinguished the apparatus with a decisive gesture, cutting the church's false miracle mid-performance. "Lestrade, place guards here and below. Nothing is to be disturbed. Young Collins will accompany you to Scotland Yard, but treat him as a witness rather than a principal until we have established the full scope of this conspiracy." As the inspector prepared to depart with his captive, Holmes turned to Dr. Whitmore with a reassuring expression. "Do not condemn Mr. Pritchard based solely on his possession of mechanical tools, Reverend. There is a superior intelligence at work here, one that purchases theatrical supplies in the West End, and moral flexibility nowhere at all." He glanced once more at the concealed apparatus, then at the gauze screens that had created such convincing supernatural effects. "Watson, we must pay an immediate visit to this Holborn theatrical supplier. If Collins speaks truthfully about his mysterious employer, we may learn who has been financing this elaborate deception and perhaps discover his ultimate motives. "The gentleman with grey whiskers?" Watson inquired. "A man of means and education, certainly, but also one with access to historical documents, mechanical expertise, and the ruthless determination to commit murder when his plans are threatened." Holmes lifted the modified lantern once more, watching as its shutter cast a final, flickering shadow against the ancient stone. "Come, Watson. The Church has revealed its mechanical secrets, but the human heart behind this deception remains to be unmasked." As they prepared to leave St. Bartholomew's, Watson could not shake the feeling that they had uncovered only the surface of a far more complex conspiracy, one that combined scholarly knowledge with criminal intent, and where the theft of a medieval reliquary might prove to be merely the visible symptom of deeper, more dangerous motivations. The departure from St. Bartholomew's was accomplished with characteristic efficiency, Lestrade remaining behind to secure the scene and transport young Collins to Scotland Yard for further questioning. Holmes, Watson, and the still-shaken Reverend Dr. Whitmore made their way through London's awakening streets, the Christmas morning fog beginning to lift as the city stirred to life around them. The theatrical supplier's handbill that Holmes had discovered among Collins's apparatus bore the address of Grimshaw and Associates, purveyors of stage effects, located in the narrow commercial district of Holborn. The establishment proved to be a cramped but well-organized shop, its windows displaying an eclectic array of stage properties, optical devices, and chemical preparations. The proprietor, Mr. Silas Grimshaw, emerged from behind a counter stacked with brass fittings and glass apparatus, a thin, precise man whose sharp eyes immediately assessed his visitors with the wariness of someone accustomed to dealing with both legitimate theatrical companies and less savoury clientele. "Gentlemen," Grimshaw began cautiously, "if this concerns the recent disturbances in Whitechapel, I must emphasize that my establishment provides materials for legitimate theatrical purposes only." Holmes produced his credentials with practiced authority. "We are investigating the purchase of specialized equipment for creating luminous effects and spectral illusions. Your shop appears to have supplied materials used in a most elaborate deception." The shopkeeper's demeanor shifted immediately from wariness to professional interest. "Ah, you must be inquiring about Mr. Ashford's recent purchases, a most particular gentleman, though his requirements were rather unusual for standard stage work." Watson leaned forward with interest. "Describe this, Mr. Ashford, if you please." Grimshaw consulted a leather-bound ledger, running his finger down columns of precise entries. A distinguished gentleman of perhaps 60 years, impeccably dressed in dark clothing of clerical cut, though he wore no collar, silver-grey whiskers, carefully trimmed, and pale eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they observed. He spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect, yet there was something unsettling about his manner. Too controlled, if you understand my meaning. Holmes's interest sharpened immediately. His specific purchases? Magnesium compounds, phosphorescent powders, precision mirrors, fine-gauge catgut, and several mechanical devices for creating movement at a distance. Most significantly, he commissioned custom modifications to our standard ghost projection apparatus, alterations that would allow operation from considerable distance and in conditions of ambient candlelight. Holmes examined the ledger entry with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the customer's signature. "The handwriting here show me exactly how he signed his name." Grimshaw indicated the relevant line where A. Ashford appeared in a precise, scholarly script. Holmes studied the formation of each letter with scientific attention, then produced his notebook to compare the signature with other samples he had collected during their investigation. "Most illuminating," he murmured with satisfaction. "The letter formation suggests someone accustomed to formal writing, possibly academic or clerical in background. Note the distinctive flourish on the capital A, a mark of educated penmanship. Dr. Whitmore peered at the signature with growing concern. That style of writing, it resembles the hand I've seen in our church records, though I cannot place it precisely. Mr. Grimshaw, Holmes continued, did this gentleman arrive alone, and did he specify where these materials were to be delivered? The shopkeeper nodded thoughtfully. Initially he came alone, but on his second visit, December 10th, he was accompanied by a younger man who remained largely silent, but asked several technical questions about gas fittings and mechanical systems. As for delivery, he provided an address in Bermondsey, a warehouse on Tooley Street, and insisted that all materials be delivered directly there rather than to any residential address. Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. A warehouse suggests preparation space away from prying eyes. Did either man mention their intended use for these materials? Mr. Ashford claimed to be preparing a special Christmas presentation for his parish, something to inspire greater devotion among his congregation. He spoke extensively about the power of visual symbolism to reinforce spiritual truths, though his theological discussions seemed oddly academic for a practicing clergyman. Watson noted the connection to their earlier discoveries. Did he show interest in any historical elements? Medieval symbolism, perhaps? Grimshaw's eyes widened with recognition. Indeed, he inquired specifically about our collection of ecclesiastical vestments, particularly those resembling medieval monastic robes. He also asked if I knew reliable sources for historical documents concerning obscure religious fraternities. He mentioned the Penitent Brothers by name, claiming he required material for historical accuracy. Dr. Whitmore's face went pale. The Penitent Brothers, the same order whose symbol we found carved in the vestry. This cannot be coincidence. Holmes's expression carried the satisfaction of a hunter closing on his quarry. Mr. Grimshaw, you have been most helpful. One final question. Did Mr. Ashford leave any additional contact information beyond the warehouse address? The shopkeeper produced a small calling card from beneath his counter. Only this, sir. He said it was for future correspondence should he require additional supplies. The card bore only a single initial, A, engraved, in the same precise style as the signature, with no address or additional identification. As they departed the shop, Holmes's mind was clearly working through the implications of their discoveries. Watson, observe how methodically our mysterious Mr. Ashford has prepared for his performance. 6 weeks of planning, custom equipment modifications, historical research, and the recruitment of at least one accomplice with technical expertise. The signature A. Ashford could be another deliberate ambiguity, Watson observed, like the AP used for deliveries to the church. Precisely. Our ghost appears to delight in creating confusion about identity while leaving just enough evidence to implicate others. The warehouse in Bermondsey suggests a base of operations, while the historical research indicates someone with genuine scholarly interests or access to such knowledge. Dr. Whitmore walked beside them in troubled silence before finally speaking. Mr. Holmes, the description of this man, the clerical bearing, the scholarly manner, the intimate knowledge of church history, it suggests someone with deep connections to ecclesiastical circles. Indeed, Reverend, someone who understands not only the technical aspects of creating supernatural illusions, but also the psychological impact such manifestations would have on a devout congregation. Holmes paused, his keen eyes reflecting the satisfaction of pieces falling into place. We must now determine whether Mr. Ashford is our ultimate adversary or merely another layer in an increasingly complex deception. As they hailed a hansom cab, Holmes's expression carried that familiar intensity Watson had learned to associate with cases approaching their resolution. The warehouse in Bermondsey must be our next destination. If Mr. Ashford has been using it as his base of operations, we may find not only evidence of his apparatus, but also clues to his true identity and ultimate motives. And if we encounter him there, Watson inquired, then we shall have the opportunity to confront the man who has orchestrated one of the most elaborate criminal deceptions I have encountered. The ghost of St. Bartholomew's is about to discover that his earthly machinations have attracted the attention of forces he did not anticipate. As their cab began the journey toward Bermondsey, Watson could not shake the feeling that they were approaching the heart of a conspiracy that extended far beyond a single night's supernatural performance. The systematic nature of the preparation, the multiple identities, and the willingness to commit murder suggested an adversary of unusual cunning and ruthless determination, one whose true motives remained tantalizingly hidden behind layers of theatrical deception and scholarly misdirection. The journey to Bermondsey carried them through London's industrial heart, where the Christmas morning quiet was broken only by the distant sounds of river traffic and the occasional clatter of early omnibuses. Holmes maintained his characteristic silence during the crossing, his sharp profile etched against the cab window as his mind clearly worked through the accumulating evidence. The fog had begun to lift as they approached Tooley Street, revealing the stark brick facades of warehouses that served London's vast commercial enterprise. Number 14 proved to be a narrow structure wedged between a rope manufacturer and a grain merchant, its facade showing the weathered anonymity common to such establishments. Holmes alighted from the cab with characteristic decisiveness, his keen eyes immediately cataloguing every detail of the building's exterior. Fresh wheel tracks in the muddy courtyard indicated recent activity, while scratches around the main door's lock mechanism suggested frequent use by someone familiar with the premises. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, kneeling to examine the ground near the entrance. "Multiple sets of footprints, including those expensive leather boots we discovered at the church. Our Mr. Ashford has indeed been using this location as his base of operations, though note this curious detail." He pointed to a faint smear darkening the door lintel. "Magnesium residue, still fresh. Someone departed in considerable haste." Holmes produced his lock-picking tools and gained entry with practiced efficiency. The warehouse interior stretched before them in shadowy vastness, illuminated only by grimy skylights that cast pale rectangles across the concrete floor. The space had been systematically organized into distinct work areas, each serving a specific purpose in the elaborate conspiracy they were uncovering. The first area contained a complete theatrical workshop. Workbenches laden with precision tools, coils of catgut, mechanical devices in various stages of assembly, and glass vials filled with phosphorescent compounds. Holmes examined each item with scientific thoroughness, his magnifying glass revealing details that would escape ordinary observation. "Note the sophistication of this operation, Watson," he observed, lifting a complex arrangement of mirrors and pulleys. "This apparatus would allow a single operator to create the illusion of spectral movement from considerable distance, while these chemical preparations could produce luminous effects lasting several hours." Against the far wall, detailed maps of St. Bartholomew's were pinned with mathematical precision, marked with red annotations indicating sight lines, timing sequences, and escape routes. A brown monk's robe hung nearby, accompanied by a pale wooden hand painted to resemble bone, the ghost's complete costume awaiting its final performance. Watson discovered a workbench scattered with correspondence, including bills of lading addressed to A. Ashford and a partially charred calling card bearing the crest of the Society of Antiquaries at Somerset House. More significantly, a note in precise handwriting listed "Vestry, gas altered, key mechanism by catgut, chancel, phosphorescent powders, Pritchard to be observed." "Note the final entry, Watson," Holmes said grimly. "Not recruited or consulted, but observed. Our adversary views his human instruments with cold calculation. Behind canvas screens they discovered what appeared to be a scholar's study. Shelves lined with ecclesiastical documents, medieval manuscripts and architectural drawings. Many bore the bookplates of various London institutions, while others showed signs of recent acquisition from antiquarian dealers. Dr. Whitmore examined the collection with growing alarm. These documents contain information that should not exist outside ecclesiastical archives: plans of the church's medieval passages, records of the penitent brothers' activities, even correspondence regarding the reliquary's historical provenance. Holmes discovered a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be 15th-century correspondence between a Brother Thomas and the then Dean of St. Bartholomew's. The faded script spoke of disputes within the penitent brothers regarding the authenticity of various relics, including references to the true fragment of the Blessed Bartholomew and concerns about substitutions made by faithless brothers. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, studying the ancient text. "Our adversary has discovered that the current reliquary may contain a medieval forgery, while the genuine relic remains hidden within the church's structure." A wooden crate yielded the most damning evidence, an assortment of silver objects that Dr. Whitmore immediately recognized as missing church treasures. Candlesticks, a chalice, and illuminated manuscript fragments lay carefully packed, alongside correspondence with M. Carow, Exchange Alley, discussing shipment after Christmas, and noting reliquary too valuable for immediate disposal. Holmes examined a second letter with particular interest. "Observe, Watson, our criminal signs himself A. Ashford, but refers to his victim as Ashworth. The similarity is no coincidence, but rather a deliberate jest, keeping his target's name before him as a form of psychological trophy." Near the crate, clear footprint impressions in spilled chalk dust told their own story. The narrow, expensive leather boots they had traced from the church, intersecting with cheaper iron-tipped prints that matched young Collins's measurements. "Two participants," Watson observed, "the mastermind and his recruited assistant." "Indeed, though note how the expensive prints dominate the space while the cheaper ones remain peripheral. Our Mr. Ashford maintains strict control over his operation." A sudden sound from the warehouse's rear section caused Holmes to raise his hand for immediate silence. Footsteps echoed across the concrete floor, measured, confident steps approaching, with knowledge of the building's layout. Holmes moved swiftly to the grimy window, peering through a cleared section of glass. "Watson, we have company. A distinguished gentleman matching Grimshaw's description approaches the main entrance. Our theatrical ghost has returned to his workshop, perhaps to retrieve evidence he left behind in his haste." Dr. Whitmore's face went pale. "What do we do, Mr. Holmes?" "We observe and learn," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with that familiar light of intellectual pursuit. "Position yourselves behind those canvas screens. If our adversary has returned to destroy evidence, we shall witness his methods firsthand. More importantly, we may finally put a face to the mind that has orchestrated this elaborate deception." As they concealed themselves among the shadows of the warehouse, Watson could hear the distinctive sound of a key turning in the main entrance lock. The ghost of St. Bartholomew's was about to reveal himself as a very human adversary, and Holmes was perfectly positioned to observe every detail of his quarry's behavior and methods. The investigation had reached its crucial turning point, where careful observation would provide the final pieces needed to complete their understanding of both the criminal's identity and his ultimate motivations. The warehouse door opened with practiced quietness, admitting a distinguished figure whose bearing immediately commanded attention despite his attempt at stealth. Through their concealment behind the canvas screens, Holmes, Watson, and Dr. Whitmore observed a tall gentleman of perhaps 60 years, his silver-grey whiskers immaculately groomed, and his dark clothing of clerical cut, though lacking any ecclesiastical collar. His pale eyes swept the warehouse interior with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to controlling every detail of his environment. The man moved with surprising agility, proceeding directly to the workbench area where he began systematically organizing evidence rather than destroying it. His actions demonstrated intimate familiarity with the space as he sorted documents into careful categories, some for preservation, others for disposal. Holmes noted the discriminating intelligence behind these choices, selecting only materials that could directly implicate him while leaving papers that might cast suspicion on others. As their quarry worked, he began speaking to himself in the manner of someone accustomed to solitary scholarly pursuits. His cultured voice carried undertones of bitter satisfaction as he examined the correspondence bearing his victim's similar name. "Poor Ashworth," he murmured, while handling the theatrical apparatus with proprietorial familiarity. So eager to expose supernatural fraud, yet blind to the very human corruption that motivated his own investigations, the irony was too perfect to resist. He moved to examine the footprint evidence in the chalk dust, his keen assessment revealing an intelligence not far removed from Holmes's own. The systematic way he catalogued what the investigators had discovered demonstrated a mind capable of complex strategic thinking. Dr. Whitmore's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but the sound caused the stranger to freeze momentarily before continuing his work with increased urgency. Holmes observed how the man's head tilted slightly, listening with the acute awareness of someone accustomed to operating in dangerous circumstances. Holmes chose his moment with characteristic precision. As the criminal bent to retrieve a concealed leather journal from the workbench, clearly containing months of detailed planning, Holmes stepped from concealment with quiet authority. "Good morning," he said calmly. "Though I suspect you prefer to conduct your scholarly pursuits without observation." The man straightened slowly, his pale eyes assessing the situation with remarkable composure for someone caught in flagrante delicto. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he replied with a slight bow, "your reputation for persistence is well deserved, though your timing is somewhat inconvenient." "The convenience was never yours to determine," Holmes replied. "Dr. Watson, Reverend Whitmore, allow me to present the gentleman who has been haunting St. Bartholomew's Church, though I suspect his connection to that institution runs considerably deeper than mere criminal opportunity." The stranger's expression shifted to one of cold amusement. "Indeed it does, Mr. Holmes. My association with St. Bartholomew's spans decades, though recent circumstances have made that relationship somewhat strained." Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his face reflecting growing recognition and horror. "Dear God, Archdeacon Morrison, but you died 18 months ago. We attended your funeral service." The revelation. The former Archdeacon Morrison died to the world when his faith in institutional integrity was finally destroyed, the man replied with bitter precision. "What stands before you is merely someone who has learned to take what the Church refused to protect." Holmes observed the transformation in their quarry's demeanour with professional interest. The discovery of his identity had removed the need for pretense, revealing a man whose scholarly exterior concealed years of accumulated resentment and carefully planned revenge. 18 months of supposed death provided excellent cover for systematic acquisition of church treasures, Morrison continued with academic detachment. The various parishes assumed their missing items had been relocated to other institutions, while the institutions believed them returned to parish custody. Administrative confusion that allowed considerable collection building. Until Sir Reginald Ashworth began investigating with uncomfortable thoroughness, Holmes observed. Morrison's eyes flashed with genuine anger. Ashworth's rational skepticism threatened to expose not supernatural fraud but very earthly theft. His systematic documentation of church treasures would inevitably have led to discovery of the missing items. As Morrison spoke, his hand moved subtly toward a mechanism concealed beneath the workbench. Holmes recognized the gesture and lunged forward, but the Archdeacon had already triggered a spring-loaded device that released a cloud of magnesium powder into the air. A brilliant flash filled the warehouse as Morrison struck a concealed spark, temporarily blinding his pursuers while he darted toward a hidden passage behind the bookcase. "After him!" Holmes called, his vision clearing quickly. "He knows every bolt hole in this warren." They pursued Morrison through a narrow corridor that led toward the Thames, but the Archdeacon's intimate knowledge of the building's layout gave him crucial advantage. By the time they reached the loading bay, only the sound of retreating footsteps echoed through the fog-shrouded alley beyond. Holmes examined the escape route with professional appreciation. Ingenious, but not unexpected from someone who has spent months planning every contingency. However, Dr. Watson, observe what our scholarly ghost left behind in his haste. The leather journal lay open on the workbench, its pages revealing months of meticulous preparation, complete with dates, methods, and most significantly, future plans involving Exchange Alley and M. Carrow. Holmes closed the journal with satisfaction. Morrison may have escaped this encounter, but he has revealed both his methods and his remaining objectives. The ghost of St. Bartholomew's has become a very human fugitive, and fugitives, Watson, inevitably make mistakes that methodical investigation can exploit. Holmes immediately turned his attention to Morrison's abandoned journal, examining each page with the methodical precision that Watson had learned to recognize as complete intellectual absorption. The leather-bound volume contained months of meticulous planning, written in the same scholarly hand they had observed at Grimshaw's establishment, revealing the systematic mind of someone who approached criminal enterprise with academic thoroughness. "Watson, observe the progression of Morrison's scheme," Holmes said, his finger tracing columns of dates and corresponding activities. Initial reconnaissance began in September, coinciding with his supposed funeral arrangements. The man literally died to the world in order to begin his criminal career with perfect anonymity. The journal entries revealed Morrison's growing obsession with what he termed ecclesiastical justice. His handwriting grew increasingly agitated as he documented discovery after discovery of church treasures being sold to private collectors, administrative incompetence, allowing valuable artifacts to disappear, and what he saw as systematic betrayal of sacred trusts by those charged with their protection. Dr. Whitmore peered over Holmes's shoulder with a mixture of fascination and horror. "The funeral service I conducted, how is such deception possible?" "Elementary misdirection," Holmes replied, turning to a particularly detailed entry. "A closed casket ceremony, citing the Archdeacon's supposed final illness, followed by immediate cremation. No body was ever viewed, and Morrison simply disappeared into London's vast anonymity while his former colleagues mourned his passing." Holmes paused at a December entry and read aloud. "December 15th. Subject continues systematic catalogue of church holdings. His methodology threatens complete exposure within days. Alternative solutions must be implemented immediately." He looked up grimly. Morrison had been observing Sir Reginald for weeks, documenting his methods and gradually realizing that Ashworth's rational approach would inevitably expose the pattern of missing treasures. Holmes produced the small tin he had discreetly pocketed from the organ loft, examining its label with his magnifying glass. "Chloroform liniment for dental practice, purloined and decanted." The vestry's gas fitting was modified to admit vapour when the tap was opened. Sir Reginald, seated as invited, would inhale a stupefying dose while the sudden darkness and ghostly display completed the terror. Watson examined the tin and nodded with professional recognition. The sweet odour we detected at the fitting, the faint congestion about the eyes noted in the preliminary examination, all consistent with chloroform poisoning. In a man with a weak heart, the combination of chemical stupefaction and supernatural terror becomes a weapon more reliable than any blade. Precisely, Watson. Morrison's scholarly mind devised a murder method that would appear to be supernatural intervention, deflecting suspicion while eliminating the threat to his carefully constructed operation. The journal painted a disturbing picture of Morrison's psychological transformation. He had convinced himself that his thefts constituted moral correction rather than criminal enterprise, referring consistently to recovering rather than stealing church property, with elaborate justifications for each acquisition. "Note how he views himself as a conservator, Watson," Holmes observed, indicating a particularly impassioned passage. "Not a thief, but someone rescuing sacred objects from unworthy custodians. His resentment of Sir Reginald is palpable. He saw Ashworth's systematic cataloguing not as preservation, but as vulgar inventory by someone incapable of appreciating deeper spiritual significance." Dr. Whitmore's face reflected profound distress as he processed the revelation of his predecessor's treachery. To fake his own death, to orchestrate such blasphemous charade, the man I respected and mourned has become a stranger to me. "The human mind, Reverend, is capable of both profound devotion and astonishing self-deception," Holmes replied with uncharacteristic gentleness. Morrison convinced himself he was acting for the greater good, even as his methods descended into theft and murder. Holmes turned to the journal's final entries, which outlined Morrison's partnership with M. Carow of Exchange Alley. The correspondence revealed a sophisticated network for disposing of stolen ecclesiastical artifacts, with Carow serving as intermediary for wealthy private collectors who asked few questions about provenance. The reliquary was to be the crown jewel of Morrison's collection, Holmes observed, studying a detailed sketch of the medieval casket. But note this curious entry: verification of authenticity required before final transaction. Our scholarly archdeacon discovered something about the reliquary that changed his entire approach. Watson leaned forward with interest. "What manner of discovery?" "The medieval documents we found suggest Morrison learned that our reliquary might be a 15th century forgery, while the genuine relic remains hidden somewhere within the church structure. The supernatural manifestation served multiple purposes, eliminating Ashworth as a threat, creating chaos to cover the theft, and positioning Morrison to search for the authentic artifact." Holmes closed the journal with satisfaction and began gathering several items from Morrison's workbench: precision mirrors, vials of phosphorescent powder, and lengths of fine catgut. "Exchange Alley, Watson. We must intercept Morrison before he completes his transaction with Carow. However, we cannot rely solely on conventional police methods." "What do you propose, Holmes?" Watson inquired, recognizing his friend's strategic mind at work. Morrison believes himself a master of theatrical illusion, understanding the power of dramatic revelation and psychological manipulation. We shall use his own methods against him. Holmes's eyes gleamed with intellectual satisfaction. The man who spent months planning a supernatural performance will not abandon his ultimate objective simply because his theatrical methods have been exposed. Holmes dispatched a street boy with urgent messages to Lestrade, directing immediate surveillance at Exchange Alley while positioning constables at strategic river access points. "We shall approach this from multiple angles, Watson. Morrison's scholarly temperament will compel him to complete his authentication process before finalizing any transaction, but his escape route knowledge gives him dangerous advantages." As they prepared to depart the warehouse, Holmes outlined his strategy with characteristic precision. "Morrison has demonstrated both scholarly brilliance and ruthless determination, but his elaborate methods also reveal psychological vulnerabilities. a man who creates supernatural manifestations to justify earthly crimes, can be manipulated through the same theatrical principles he employs. Dr. Whitmore clutched his predecessor's walking stick with renewed determination. "What role do you require of me, Mr. Holmes?" "Your moral authority combined with carefully constructed revelation may be precisely what breaks Morrison's composure, Reverend. The Archdeacon has deep-seated respect for ecclesiastical symbols, even as he desecrates them. Your presence will force him to confront the contradiction between his stated principles and criminal actions." As their hansom began the journey toward Exchange Alley, Watson could sense they were approaching the climax of one of Holmes's most complex cases. The ghost of St. Bartholomew's had revealed himself as a very human adversary, whose scholarly brilliance was matched only by his capacity for self-deception and ruthless determination. The final confrontation would test not only Holmes's deductive abilities, but his understanding of the dangerous intersection between intellectual pride and moral corruption. The stage was set for a battle of minds where theatrical illusion would meet logical deduction, and where the ultimate resolution would require unmasking not just a criminal, but the psychological forces that had transformed a respected churchman into a murderous thief who justified his crimes through elaborate, scholarly rationalization. Exchange Alley proved to be a narrow, shadowed thoroughfare where London's more discreet commercial enterprises conducted their affairs away from public scrutiny. The fog had begun to lift, but the cramped passage retained its atmosphere of conspiracy and concealment. Holmes directed their approach with characteristic precision, positioning Lestrade's constables at strategic points, while maintaining visual surveillance of Monsieur Caro's establishment through his collapsible telescope. The antiquarian's shop presented an unremarkable facade, its grimy windows displaying the typical assortment of tarnished silver and faded manuscripts that attracted both legitimate scholars and those with more questionable interests. Holmes observed the building's layout with professional attention, noting the rear courtyard that would provide Morrison with multiple escape routes should he detect their presence prematurely. "Caro's establishment serves as more than a simple curiosity shop," Holmes murmured, studying the premises through his lens. "Note the reinforced shutters and the discreet rear entrance, modifications that suggest transactions requiring considerable privacy. Morrison has chosen his accomplice well." Dr. Whitmore adjusted his grip on the walking stick, his clerical bearing lending natural authority despite the circumstances. "How shall we proceed, Mr. Holmes? Direct confrontation might cause Morrison to destroy evidence or attempt immediate flight." "We shall employ Morrison's own methods against him," Holmes replied with evident satisfaction. "A man who creates supernatural manifestations to justify earthly crimes can be manipulated through the same psychological principles he exploits. Watson, prepare the materials we collected from his workshop." Holmes produced the vials of phosphorescent powder and precision mirrors they had recovered from Morrison's warehouse, along with lengths of fine catgut. With practiced efficiency, he began rigging a simple but effective apparatus near Caro's front window, mirrors positioned to catch and redirect gaslight, chemical screens to create luminous effects, and nearly invisible wires that would allow manipulation from a distance. The scholar's pride will compel him to authenticate the reliquary before completing any transaction, Holmes explained as he worked. "We shall provide him with authentication of a most unexpected variety." Their preparations were interrupted by the appearance of a distinguished figure emerging from the alley's fog-shrouded depths. Morrison approached Caro's establishment with the measured confidence of someone conducting familiar business, his silver-grey whiskers immaculately groomed and his dark clothing lending him an air of ecclesiastical authority despite his criminal purposes. Holmes waited until Morrison had entered the shop before activating his apparatus. The mirrors caught the interior gaslight and redirected it through the chemical screens, creating an eerie phosphorescent glow that bathed the shop's windows in the same supernatural luminescence that had terrified the congregation of St. Bartholomew's. "Now, gentlemen," Holmes said quietly, "we confront the ghost of St. Bartholomew's in his earthly form." They entered the shop as Morrison stood examining the stolen reliquary with a jeweler's loupe, his scholarly attention completely absorbed by the medieval craftsmanship. The supernatural lighting effects caused him to look up sharply, his pale eyes widening as he recognized both the familiar luminescence and his unwelcome visitors. "Mr. Holmes," Morrison said with forced composure, though his hands trembled slightly as he set down the magnifying instrument, "your persistence continues to exceed reasonable bounds." "As does your capacity for self-deception, Archdeacon," Holmes replied, stepping forward with quiet authority. "You stand surrounded by the stolen treasures of the church you claim to serve, having committed murder to protect your criminal enterprise, yet you still maintain the pretense of scholarly preservation." Morrison's mask of scholarly dignity began to crack under Holmes's relentless logic. "You understand nothing of true preservation, Holmes. These treasures were disappearing through administrative incompetence and clerical carelessness. I have rescued them from unworthy custodians who would have allowed them to be sold or dispersed to private collectors." "By becoming a private collector yourself," Watson observed grimly. "Your justifications ring hollow, Morrison." Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his moral authority evident despite the shocking circumstances. "Morrison, I conducted your funeral service with genuine grief for a man I respected. To discover that your death was a blasphemous charade designed to cover systematic theft. How could you fall so far from grace?" The psychological pressure proved too much for Morrison's carefully constructed rationalizations. His scholarly composure shattered completely as he clutched the reliquary to his chest with desperate possessiveness. "You fools!" he cried, his voice cracking with years of accumulated bitterness. "The relic you worship is a medieval forgery. The true fragment lies hidden in the north pier of the chancel arch, behind the Sanctus niche, where the penitent brothers concealed it centuries ago. I would have restored it to worthy custodians who understand its true significance." Holmes's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as Morrison's confession confirmed the historical theories they had developed. "And Sir Reginald Ashworth's systematic investigation threatened to expose your thefts before you could locate the genuine artifact." "Ashworth was a threat to preservation itself," Morrison replied with bitter conviction. "His rational cataloguing would have led to the dispersal of sacred objects to museums and universities, destroying their spiritual context forever." Lestrade's constables moved swiftly as Morrison's psychological defences collapsed entirely. The Archdeacon made one desperate attempt to escape through the shop's rear exit, but Holmes had anticipated this movement, and the police were positioned precisely where his flight would carry him. "The game is concluded, Morrison," Holmes announced as the manacles clicked into place. "Your theatrical methods cannot obscure the fundamental truth. You have become precisely what you claim to oppose, treating sacred objects as commercial commodities while justifying murder through elaborate scholarly rationalizations." As Morrison was led away, still clutching his stolen reliquary, Holmes turned to examine the shop's remaining evidence with renewed interest. "The case may be concluded, Watson, but Morrison's historical discoveries raise intriguing questions about St. Bartholomew's architectural secrets. We must verify his claims about the genuine relic's location." The ghost of St. Bartholomew's had finally been revealed as a very human creation, driven by the dangerous combination of intellectual pride and moral corruption that could transform even the most devoted scholar into a murderous thief. The return to St. Bartholomew's was accomplished with characteristic urgency, Holmes having dispatched urgent messages to secure the services of a cathedral mason and the diocesan surveyor. The ancient church stood peacefully in the afternoon light, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven with the same dignity that had marked centuries of worship, seemingly untouched by the morning's dramatic revelations. Holmes approached the North Chancel Pier with the methodical precision Watson had learned to associate with his most significant discoveries. The Sanctus niche Morrison had mentioned proved to be a small medieval alcove carved directly into the stone and partially concealed by centuries of accumulated grime and later decorative additions. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, running his fingers along the ancient stonework with almost reverent care. "The mortar here shows clear signs of disturbance, though the work was accomplished with considerable skill to avoid casual detection. Note the subtle difference in coloration and the barely perceptible seam where the original stone meets later additions." Using specialized chisels borrowed from the church's restoration supplies, Holmes carefully removed the false backing that concealed Morrison's historical discovery. The mason, a steady craftsman with decades of experience in cathedral work, assisted with the delicate operation while Dr. Whitmore watched with growing anticipation. Behind the medieval facade lay a small cavity containing an object wrapped in oiled silk, a reliquary of breathtaking beauty and obvious antiquity, its silver surface bearing the distinctive craftsmanship of the 12th century. Alongside it, sealed in a lead casket, lay a collection of parchment documents whose preservation spoke to the careful planning of their medieval custodians. Dr. Whitmore examined the artifacts with scholarly reverence, his trained eye immediately recognizing both the superior workmanship of the genuine reliquary and the significance of the accompanying documents. Holmes carefully unrolled the ancient parchments, revealing correspondence between Brother Thomas of the Penitent Brothers and successive deans of St. Bartholomew's. "The truth, gentlemen, proves more complex than even Morrison suspected," Holmes announced, studying the faded script with his magnifying glass. These documents reveal that the original relic was indeed removed and hidden during the political upheavals of the 15th century. However, the substitution was not made to deceive, but to preserve both the genuine artifact and the faith of the congregation. The medieval correspondence painted a picture of devoted monks facing impossible choices during times of civil unrest. Rather than risk the loss of their most precious relic to secular authorities or common thieves, they had created an elaborate but pious deception, commissioning a beautiful replica reliquary and consecrating it with appropriate ceremony while hiding the original for future generations to rediscover. Morrison's scholarly research was accurate, Holmes continued, but his interpretation was fatally flawed. He saw deliberate fraud where there was actually sacrificial preservation. The medieval brothers chose to become custodians of a secret rather than witnesses to a desecration. Watson shook his head in amazement. So Morrison committed murder and elaborate theft to expose what he believed was a centuries-old deception, only to discover that the deception itself was an act of faith. Precisely, Watson. The irony would have appealed to his scholarly sensibilities had his pride not blinded him to the possibility that others might share his devotion to preservation, albeit through different methods. Dr. Whitmore carefully secured both the genuine reliquary and the medieval documents, his expression reflecting profound gratitude, tempered by sadness at the circumstances of their discovery. We shall establish proper scholarly protocols for studying these artifacts, ensuring they receive the academic attention Morrison claimed to desire while maintaining their spiritual significance for our congregation. Young Timothy Collins, released from custody, once his limited role in the deception was fully established, returned to his duties with the church organ, though his experience had clearly sobered his previously carefree nature. The boy had learned harsh lessons about the consequences of accepting payment for actions he did not fully understand. Abel Pritchard, vindicated of suspicion, but deeply shaken by his predecessor's betrayal, resumed his duties as senior churchwarden with renewed dedication to protecting the church's treasures through legitimate means. His mechanical expertise would now be employed in developing better security systems rather than investigating supernatural manifestations. As they prepared to leave St. Bartholomew's, Holmes provided his characteristic final explanation of the criminal's methods and psychology. Morrison's plan reveals both the reach and the fatal flaw of an intellectual fanatic. He understood stagecraft, acoustics, optics, and crowd psychology, hence the catgut manipulation, phosphorescent powders, modified gas fittings, and projected spectral images. His technical execution was nearly flawless. Yet he miscounted human nature, Watson observed. Indeed, he assumed those who saw would not test, that those who doubted would not investigate systematically. Sir Reginald's methodical cataloguing of church treasures threatened to reveal the pattern of thefts that Morrison wished to attribute to administrative negligence. The Archdeacon's pride could not endure such pedestrian scrutiny of his elaborate justifications. Holmes paused in the chancel where Morrison's ghostly performance had terrified the Christmas Eve congregation. The murder method itself demonstrates his scholarly approach to crime. Chloroform vapor introduced through the modified gas fitting, requiring only that Sir Reginald open the tap at a prearranged signal. The terror was completed by darkness and spectral display, while the locked room was achieved through catgut manipulation of the key mechanism, ingenious but not supernatural. As the winter afternoon drew toward evening, Holmes, Watson, and Dr. Whitmore made their way through London's fog-shrouded streets toward Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson had promised a proper Christmas dinner despite the day's dramatic interruptions. The case presents fascinating questions about the nature of truth and faith, Watson, Holmes observed, his keen eyes reflecting on the moral complexities they had encountered. Morrison's knowledge was genuine, his historical discoveries were significant, and his concern for preserving sacred artifacts was sincere. Yet his methods transformed legitimate scholarship into criminal enterprise and sacred devotion into murderous obsession. Dr. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. The medieval brothers chose to preserve faith through pious deception, while Morrison chose to expose deception through impious destruction. Both claimed to serve higher purposes. The difference, Holmes replied, lies in humility. The brothers acted to preserve something greater than themselves, while Morrison acted to vindicate his own intellectual superiority. Pride, gentlemen, is not merely a sin, it is a most unreliable accomplice in any enterprise. As they settled before the fire at 221B Baker Street, Holmes made his final observations about the case. The supernatural, Watson, invariably proves to be merely the spectacular when subjected to logical analysis. Morrison's ghost was a creation of mirrors and chemicals, mechanical devices and psychological manipulation, yet the human capacity for self-deception proved far more mysterious than any supernatural manifestation. Watson raised his glass in a Christmas toast. To the ghost of St. Bartholomew's, may he rest in peace within the confines of Pentonville Prison. Holmes smiled with quiet satisfaction, already reaching for the evening papers, where other mysteries awaited his attention. Indeed, Watson, though I suspect Morrison will find prison library facilities adequate for continuing his historical research, albeit under rather different circumstances. The case of the ghost at midnight mass had concluded with the triumph of rational investigation over supernatural deception, proving once again that the most complex mysteries yield their secrets to methodical observation and logical deduction. Yet the human elements of pride, obsession, and moral corruption remained as mysterious as ever, reminding Holmes that while criminal methods might be exposed, the psychological forces that drive men to crime would continue to challenge his understanding of human nature. Outside their window, London's Christmas evening settled into peaceful quiet, the fog lifting to reveal stars that had witnessed centuries of human drama, both sacred and profane, within the ancient walls of St. Bartholomew's Church. The ghost had been laid to rest not through exorcism, but through the far more powerful forces of logic, justice, and the enduring human capacity to choose preservation over destruction, humility over pride, and truth over spectacle.